Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name is Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. But before we get on to that, we've got to hear from our sponsors, our loyal, fabulous sponsors. So this episode of the podcast is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. As you have no doubt heard me say before on the podcast, ASA is an absolutely fantastic organisation. It's run entirely by volunteers, but it does need your support to continue operating. Membership to ASA is just $50 Australian. ASA needs members so it can support animal studies scholars in their work. So if you're not a member of ASA, please think about joining. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode is also brought to you by MC Pony. MC Pony is Elizabeth Usher. That's her real name, Elizabeth Usher. Now, MC Pony is a songwriter, a hip-hop artist, and someone who's very passionate about animal issues. So get over to MC Pony's webpage. Also check her out on YouTube and Facebook. And listen to her music. See what she's up to. Enjoy some rhymes from someone who's very passionate about animals. That's MC Pony. Okay, let's get down to business. Now, this episode of Protecting Animals is coming to you from the beautiful Portuguese countryside. It's an absolutely stunning, glorious day. We're sitting outside, and I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Angela Roberts. Now, Ange was the founder and long-time leader of the organisation Uncaged, the UK-based animal protection organisation Uncaged, which later became the Centre for Animals and Social Justice. So we're going to hear all about the history of these two very important UK-based animal protection organisations. Welcome to the podcast, Ange.
Hello, and thank you.
So, Ange, why did you get involved in animal rights?
Well, for me, it was an accidental involvement. I became vegetarian about 18 or 19 years old. I did that just for my own reasons. I didn't know any vegetarians. I didn't know anybody who campaigned for animals. And at that time, I actually didn't even realise that we had an animal rights movement, let alone a vegetarian society or a vegan society. I did that because I've always been an animal lover. As a child, I was crazy about animals in a quite unethical way. You know, I wanted to go to the zoos and the circuses. I wanted to see the animals and pet the animals. And so I just felt a deep connection with particularly the pets I had as a child. And I can remember one afternoon sitting in the garden with my dog at the time, Rusty, who I loved very much. I was probably about 7, maybe 8 at the time. I was sat in the garden with him. I had my arms around him and we were playing. And I kind of realised that I had a relationship with him, even though obviously we couldn't speak to each other. I felt that we understood each other and knew each other well. And just in that moment, it struck me that if that was the case for Rusty, then it was probably the case for all animals. And I guess that is the moment I really started to think animals were not just something that humans could use to eat or entertain them, but that they were individuals and that they had their own needs, their own personalities. And I decided then I wanted to become vegetarian. Unfortunately, my parents were not sympathetic and they were concerned that I wouldn't get a healthy diet, and so they point blank refused. And so I didn't become vegetarian until I left home.
So, and you did something quite monumental that probably a lot of listeners maybe have dreamt of doing or, would love to do in an ideal world. And that is you created your own organisation. Can you tell us a little bit about what was involved in establishing a new animal rights organisation?
Yes, I can. So here I was, an animal-loving vegetarian, completely unaware of the animal rights movement, and I bumped into a couple of people. At the time, I worked in a printer's shop, and a couple of local activists came and wanted leaflets and letterheads and things like that making. So I chatted with them, and they left me a lot of leaflets to get an idea of the kind of thing that they wanted to do. I spent the afternoon in the office and I read all the leaflets. I was reduced to tears. I was just completely shocked at the information I read. Mostly the leaflets were about vivisection, which was something I was almost completely ignorant of. And when the activists came back the next day, I said, look, we'll do all your printing for free. And I kind of got involved from there. Initially, I went on an information stall in a town centre one Saturday afternoon, trying to get people to sign a petition, handing out leaflets. And the response from the public was just incredible. And I pretty much packed in my job there and then and got involved on a local basis with this organisation. Obviously, it's not unusual in the animal rights movements for people to have personality clashes and ideological differences. And so for those reasons, that organisation didn't last very long. However, myself and Lynn Williamson, who also worked for this particular group, broke away and set up Uncaged. That was in November 1993. As a brand new anti-vivisection organisation, Lynn had worked for the NAVs, and so that was her area, and that's why we went in the anti-vivisection route initially. Although when we chose the name Uncaged, this is how naive we were. We believed we'd be able to end vivisection pretty quickly, and so we wanted a name that would allow us to then move on to other areas of animal exploitation, which is why we chose Uncaged.
Wonderful. And now I won't ask you how you went on ending vivisection, because I think perhaps we know that there's still a struggle ahead. So you started working on use of animals in research, and when I first became aware of Uncaged, to me, I don't know if it was just a particular flyer I saw or a particular conversation, but I really associated you with campaigning for elephants and perhaps zoos and things like that. So was that an area you got into? No, I'm confused.
No, not at all. No. I mean, I know elephants have been used previously a long time ago in animal experimentation. I don't think they still are, certainly not in the UK. So our area, I guess we became known for a particular focus on xenotransplantation, which at that time was a new area of research. And just a quick summary of the aims of the research was to breed pigs that had been genetically altered to have human-like genes and qualities in order to then harvest their organs to use in human transplantation. And the research involved using said pigs, and the recipients for the organs at that time were wild-caught baboons. And the results of the experiments were pretty horrific. And we campaigned on that very vigorously. We were fortunate enough to be given a huge cache of information detailing what was happening in this particular area of research, and it was appalling. So we, perhaps again rather naively, decided we would publish all this information on the internet. And of course, the organisation behind the research took legal action against us and led to our huge legal battle with Novartis.
Yes, so in many ways, you're kind of the McLibel of the animal rights movement in a sense. So it was this massive, legal battle with you, of course, as the very much the underdog.
Very much.
Can you talk us through what happened with the legal case?
Yes, I mean, basically, they initially, it was Immutran, and they were the company set up specifically to conduct the xenotransplantation research, who, because we'd obviously published their information on the internet, they came after us initially for breaching their confidentiality and copyright. Very quickly, we had to take the website down. And then a long battle ensued as we fought for the right to publish the information because we believed it was in the public interest. And eventually we were successful and we were able to publish that information with some of the more sensitive details redacted. And as a direct result of our campaign, that research ended in the UK, and many other countries in the world looked at the information, looked at the results of our campaign, and also banned the research. It hasn't ended altogether, unfortunately, but that was pretty much the nail in the coffin for the idea of animal organs for human use.
Mm. And so when I think about that court case, again, I might be mistaken, so please correct me, but I understood that it also had an impact on the way in which the Home Office went about assessing pain and suffering in research animals.
I'm not sure if it was directly a result of that. In 1986, there was a change to the Act where they tried very much to give the impression that they were considering the welfare of the animals alongside the potential benefits of the research. And in England, there's been a strong anti-vivisection movement, really, ever since Queen Victoria. And there were two big groups at the time, the NAVs and the BUAV. And there were many groups that were covering different issues that also covered vivisection. And I think as a result, the government did try to give the impression that they were considering that the whole pain levels, and they ended up dividing research into three tiers of suffering: mild, moderate, and severe. And the more severe experiments were supposedly going to attract more scrutiny. In reality, as we proved with the information we published from Immutran, the Home Office pretty much worked with the researchers to help them rebrand the severity of the pain that the animals were suffering in order to avoid extra scrutiny. So like many things that the British government do, and I know other governments do, on paper, it looks like they're doing the right thing. Behind the scenes, clearly, industry pulls the strings.
So, about 10 years ago, you made the decision to transition from Uncaged into the Centre for Animals and Social Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit about what prompted you to make that change?
Yes, I think we'd been campaigning for coming up for 20 years. And during that time, I personally became increasingly depressed about the lack of advancement that the movement was making for animals. Certainly in the area of vivisection, the number of animals used each year was increasing. Other areas, things were just not getting better. Very little progress, even on, trivial uses of animals like cosmetic testing. We couldn't even get that banned effectively. And so I started to realise that we were in a position that most organisations are, where we're campaigning and protesting against an existing government policy. And what I came to see was you've got very little chance of changing that policy because industry has the government's ear, and the government knows that although the public is very concerned about animal welfare, that they can actually just pay lip service to that. And the government is very good at saying, we have the strongest animal welfare laws in the world, and therefore there's no need for us to concern ourselves to improve the situation for animals. And it was that lack of progress and realising that we didn't have a political voice for animals that combined with the amazing Minding Animals conference in Australia, which was my first exposure really to academics who were campaigning and obviously working and researching in the area of animal rights, that made me think, actually maybe campaigning and protesting has got limited use, and perhaps a focus on government policy and trying to change how the government operates around animals would maybe be more successful.
And has that come to pass, or has it also been a hard road hard path to hoe on the other end, the kind of influencing it through the academy, etc.?
Yes, it hasn't been particularly successful, unfortunately. What we had in Britain, obviously in 2010, was an election that voted the Conservatives back into power. Traditionally, the Conservatives are not an animal-friendly party. And in fact, they came back into power intending to overturn we call it a hunt ban in the UK, but in fact hunting isn't banned at all. And what we had on that particular issue was just a small tweak in the policy that meant you could still hunt and kill animals, but not with a pack of dogs, only with 2 dogs. But still, this was lauded, and quite rightly, I think, as a progression. And one of the Tories' key campaigns when they came to power was to overturn the hunt ban. And so I think for us then, the idea of making any progress politically for animals, we just knew it wasn't going to happen. And so we spent our first few years trying to enlist the support of other campaigning organisations. And we had a moderate amount of success. I think maybe 15 of the bigger organisations signed up in support of our approach. But actually getting the campaigners to switch from the long-established protesting, petitioning kind of approach to let's all just have one big ask. And the ask should be for governments to be, open to animals by having a commissioner or a body within government whose sole purpose was to protect the interests of animals. So far, that hasn't happened, but the Labour Party now have that as official policy. And more of the bigger groups are kind of seeing that it's the right way to go. So we're still building up on that front, but I feel positive about that. I do think we can achieve something there.
Wonderful. So, Ange, you're in a very unique position of having basically really dedicated almost all of your working life to working professionally to improve things for animals in the UK. Looking back on, your decades working in that field, what are your reflections? What would you have done differently? What do you see when you look at the movement?
I think, and I guess this is almost inevitable, that when you're first inspired to campaign for animals, and I definitely felt this was the case, you immerse yourself and find out everything that's happening to animals. You look at all of the suffering involved. It's appalling, the numbers, it's just shocking. And I guess like everyone else, you think, well, this is just so awful. All I have to do is tell other people that this is happening and it will have to stop. And so initially I was very enthusiastic about educating the public and thinking, and obviously we do need the public behind us in this movement. It's essential. But I thought that would be enough. I thought, if we could tell people how bad things were, everyone would be disgusted and things would change. And, I spent nearly 20 years trying to achieve that before I realised 2 things, I think. One is that the public, certainly in the UK, are already ahead of current policy on animals. So focusing on educating the public, while it was important, began to feel like it was a little bit of a waste of time and that the focus should switch to trying to influence policy. And I did basically move away from the public education and campaigning and protesting to set up the Centre for Animals and Social Justice, and to try and have a presence in academia, a presence in the movement, and a presence in the policy making arena. And that is what the CSJ is aiming to do still.
Wonderful. And we were just having a bit of a chat before we started recording. I'm interested in your reflections on the role of women in the movement. So one of the things that I've been looking at in my research, and this is research that I've been doing with Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Yvette Watt, we've been having a look at some of the gender dimensions around animal studies scholars and also the animal protection movement. And, it's quite something for a woman to establish her own organisation and be at the head of it. So I'm just wondering if you have any, reflections looking back at gender roles in the movement.
Interestingly, the situation in the UK, and I think this is still the case, but certainly it was when we set up Uncaged, is that most of the big groups were led by women. And I think Andrew Tyler at Animal Aid was probably the only exception at the time. And so it didn't feel unusual, or particularly groundbreaking or anything like that. But I have reflected on the situation. And, you read often in statistics that more women are likely to be vegetarian than men. And generally women are considered maybe more empathetic to animals and in general. And I have wondered whether the lack of men, and obviously this isn't something I'm happy about, but whether the lack of men in the movement has meant it hasn't been seen as a particularly serious movement. I don't know if the two are connected, but whether it's been easier for people and the government in particular to say, oh yeah, it's mostly women and they're sympathetic and maybe we don't have to take them too seriously. And I do wonder whether that has had a role in the fact that it hasn't become, a particularly big or important movement yet.
So veganism or plant-based eating seems to be on the ascent, particularly in the UK. London, it seems to be quite a vegan-friendly city nowadays. Does that fill you with optimism, seeing a new generation of people embracing plant-based eating?
I am pleased to see a lot more people becoming vegan, and I'm particularly pleased to see how much more vegan provision there is in Britain. Certainly that's not the case here in Portugal just yet, but in any major supermarket in England now you find pretty much a vegan section of chilled foods, which is something I would never have imagined even 5 years ago, quite honestly. The numbers of people trying veganism and the numbers of flexitarians, the growing awareness of the environmental impact of farming animals. It is encouraging to see people are making this change. But obviously you and I chatted a little bit about this yesterday, and I think we both share a concern that it might just be a passing fad. And this kind of goes back to the whole reason for my change in direction. So, it's great to encourage individual people to change their diets and to persuade them to be more ethical in their shopping practices and stuff like that. But that, for me, is not cementing the change, whereas changing in government policy would achieve the changes and I think would have more impact. So it's great, as a vegan, it's great that there's more vegan food out there, and obviously that means it's easier for people to try and maybe become vegan. But it's, for me, it still really doesn't feel it's necessarily a permanent change.
Well, Ange, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, indeed.
Can you recall the first time you started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
Yes, I would say it was at that moment in my back garden with Rusty, my dog, and just realising that, he was an individual. He had his own likes and dislikes. You could tell when he was happy, you could tell when he was sad. And it just struck me there and then that for us to ignore that animals are, I mean, I probably didn't know what the word sentient meant back then, but that's exactly what we do. You know, as a society, we think animals, we don't care about their feelings and we don't care about their suffering. And for me, that was the moment when I realised they're not just a mass of something different, but they are individuals.
Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Yes, I can. Again, probably about the same time as a very young girl, I joined my local branch of the RSPCA and I organised a sponsored walk on our school fields. It was absolutely wazzing it down with rain. But a lot of people turned up and we marched around in our wellies and raised money to support the work of the RSPCA.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
For me, I would have to say it would be Dan Lyons. And I was so impressed by him, I married him. But Dan was the first campaigner I met who really did have a different approach. He's amazingly clever, deeply intellectual, and a very deep thinker. And he changed the way I thought about the whole situation. And his groundbreaking PhD really did open up my eyes to the whole situation where industry has a network within government that allows them to basically dictate the law, which the animal rights movement just doesn't have. We don't have that power. And I think, you know, Dan opened my eyes to that and made me want to change how I approach the situation.
And Dan's been a previous guest on the program, so if you want to hear more about his PhD and subsequent book, you can go back and have a listen to that episode. So what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
For me, it would be a focus on government policy. So even though I am no longer active in the movement, I keep a bit of an eye on what's happening and I look at the different organisations. And I find it quite depressing sometimes. I look at some of the big, wealthy organisations who, you know, have an opportunity to have impact. And I will see them off, you know, they'll be campaigning on fairly small areas, still touching on things like cosmetic testing for animals, little areas that aren't really going to amount to much change for animals. And I understand why this happens, having run an organisation. I understand the need to bring the public with you in order to raise funds so that your organisation can exist and do the work it needs to do. But then you tend to focus on the issues that you know people are going to agree with you on, like cosmetic testing. And so it becomes a little vicious cycle maybe where organisations are financially very successful. And I don't want to be too negative. A lot of them do some fantastic work, but they're actually not achieving very much. You know, my wish would be that every organisation, not just in Britain, but certainly I'd like it to start in Britain, would shift their focus to back the Centre for Animals Social Justice and our campaign for a presence within the policy network. And that, I believe, would open the door for all of the different changes that the different groups want to achieve.
And so, Ange, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be? It
would be that humans would stop using animals at all, completely.
Mm. So, Ange, that concludes the 5 quick questions. Normally I say, what are you working on next? But as you note, you're retired.
I am, yes.
So what are you working on next?
Well, I'm working on trying to find a lovely plot of land here in Portugal and to become self-sufficient, growing all my own fruit and veggies, to have a slightly more chilled out lifestyle. But also myself and friends here are trying to organise vegan pop-up restaurants. And so I will probably never completely stop campaigning, but certainly on a more lifestyle approach now, I think would be something I'd enjoy more. And there are activists here in Portugal, and in fact they have a political party for animals called PAN, P-A-N, and I know Dan, he's still working and still very active, wants to get involved, and so I'm looking forward to seeing maybe if we can push things a little more here in Portugal, where we're less advanced, I think, on animal welfare issues than we were in the UK.
Yeah. So how can people find out more about the Centre for Animals and Social Justice?
Well, they can log on to our website, and there they will see a podcast with Dan, which kind of summarises the aims of the organisation, along with our kind of major initiatives that we're focusing on, and the whole reason why we are focusing on the policy network area. So that would be the casj.org.uk.
Wonderful. Well, Ange, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals, and we have an Instagram account. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.